Everybody could turn to page 392 to the beginning of A Room of One's Own. Actually, no, don't turn to A Room of One's Own. Let's first actually go to Professions for Women, which is the slightly more minor essay that the anthology attaches to A Room of One's Own. But there's something that I really want to deal with here that references directly a lot of what Alex and Megan were talking about. So, what is the figure that is standing in Woolf's way as she tries to become a writer? The specific figure that she has to deal with if she wants to be a writer. Yeah, the angel in the house is the thing that is directly in her path that needs to be moved out of the way, right? So let's look at her description of the angel in the house and how she deals with this figure. We turn to page 401. What could be easier than to write articles and to buy Persian cats with the profits? But wait a moment, articles have to be about something. Mine, I seem to remember, was about a novel by a famous man. And while I was writing this review, I discovered that if I were going to review books, I should need to do battle with a certain phantom. And that phantom was a woman, and when I came to know her better, I called her after the heroine of a famous poem, The Angel in the House. It was she who used to come between me and my paper when I was writing reviews. It was she who bothered and wasted my time and so tormented me that at last I killed her. You who come of a younger and happier generation may not have heard of her. You may not know what I mean by the angel in the house. I will describe her as shortly as I can. She was intensely sympathetic. She was immensely charming. She was utterly unselfish. She excelled in the difficult arts of family life. She sacrificed herself daily. If there was chicken, she took the leg. If there was a draft, she sat in it. In short, she was so constituted that she never had a mind or a wish of her own, but preferred to sympathize always with the minds and wishes of others. Above all, I need not say it, she was pure. Her purity was supposed to be her chief beauty, her blushes her great grace. In those days, the last of Queen Victoria, every house had its angel. So, are all of the qualities that she associates with the angel in the house, qualities that we would necessarily think of as negative? Do we generally think that it's bad to be unselfish or self-sacrificing? So why does Woolf regard these qualities as problematic?
She's probably saying, like, people expect her to be like the angel in the house, or expect her to meet the expectations like the angel in the house, I guess.
Okay, on the one hand, yeah, it is an unrealistic set of expectations for anyone to meet, right? To always be graceful and charming, and to always sacrifice one's own interests for one's husband or children, right? But what else is problematic?
Her writing, because if she wants to write what she had, well, in order for her to be an angel in the house, she might have to say certain things like the way that she doesn't want to say them instead of speaking her mind the way that she really wants to.
Yeah, that's what kind of comes out in what follows here, right? Is that the angel keeps looking over her shoulder and telling her to be nicer, right? Telling her not to really speak her mind because we can't hurt this poor man's feelings, right? So the angel encourages her to be dishonest and to not write what she really believes, right? When I came to write, I encountered her with the very first words. The shadow of her wings fell on my page. I heard the rustling of her skirts in the room. Directly, that is to say, I took my pen in my hand to review that novel by a famous man. She slipped behind me and whispered, "My dear, you are a young woman. You are writing about a book that has been written by a man. Be sympathetic, be tender, flatter, deceive, use all the arts and wiles of our sex. Never let anybody guess that you have a mind of your own. Above all, be pure. And she made as if to guide my pen. I now record the one act for which I take some credit to myself, though the credit rightly belongs to some excellent ancestors of mine who left me a certain sum of money, shall we say £500 a year, so that it was not necessary for me to depend solely on charm for my living. I turned upon her and caught her by the throat. I did my best to kill her. My excuse, if I were to be had up in a court of law, would be that I acted in self-defense. Had I not killed her, she would have killed me. So what other reality here that enables her writing does Woolf reference? What is it that gives her the ability to kill the angel with fewer consequences?
She already lives on her own, and she makes her own money.
Yeah, she has a small inheritance, right? She has an independent income. So she is not, as she puts it, solely dependent on charm for her living, right? So we can actually trace this idea back to near the beginning of the course, right? Think back to the mortal immortal. And the character of Bertha and all of those gift book heroines that we talked about, right? What was Bertha's basic situation in Immortal Immortal? Does anybody remember?
She was an orphan at first, and she got adopted by a rich family.
Yep. She's an orphan. She's adopted by an old rich woman who has no children of her own, right? And what is the only power that Bertha has over Winsey? Her beauty, right? Exactly. And once that goes, she becomes cranky, she becomes peevish, she gets nasty, right? So, in that story, right, beauty and charm are a woman's only power. Let's think back to Goblin Market. As well, right? Now, in Goblin Market, Laura is recuperated by her sister, right? But there's still this sense that purity is the more desirable path, right? That while women should take care of each other, you know, Laura really does make a miscalculation and fall when she gives her lock of hair to the goblins and feasts with them, right? And the ultimate outcome for both sisters is that they become wives with children, right? You know, where they were once self-sufficient, running their own farm. At the end of the poem, they were wives with children, even if we never really see or meet the husbands, right? But I think that we can also say that Laura and Lizzie's independent income or sort of independent lives also gives them a weapon against the goblins, right? The fact that they don't really need the goblin fruits, that they don't actually need anyone else. And I think that's sort of more analogous to what Woolf is talking about with herself here, right? What did she say she bought with the first proceeds from her writing, right? Or the first check she got for having written something? What did she buy with it? And what does that indicate about her social standing and her economic needs?
If she didn't have to spend it on like necessities, then it kind of shows that she's okay where she is.
Yeah, she bought a Persian cat, right? And she said she notes that this is kind of ridiculous, right? This was a frivolous purchase, right? I took my first paycheck and I bought a Persian cat with it. because they didn't actually need groceries or rent. She takes her second check and she buys a motor car with it, right? Again, something that she didn't really need, something that at the time she was writing, would be a relatively frivolous purchase, a kind of extravagant purchase. But the fact that she's able to make these extravagant purchases indicates that she is not bound by the same restrictions that a lot of other women are because of her independent income, right? Now, what other material factor does she say leads women to enter the writing profession before they can enter others?
Because society won't let them.
Well, just think about purely material economic factors that she lists in her writing here. We look on page 401, bottom of the first paragraph.
There wasn't a precedent of women going into the industry, but there was a precedent of women going into other careers.
It's less about precedent and more about the availability of materials, right? So if we look at,
Oh,
That's
how
right.
much the money, how much the paper cost?
yeah, the cheapness of writing paper, right? Anybody can purchase writing paper. So if you have writing paper and enough privacy, you can be a writer, right? This is something that is easier then to get into than, say, law or medicine, right? That requires advanced degrees and more expensive materials. So I think that this is the big thrust of both of Woolf's pieces here, right? Is that what stops women and working class people from advancing in the professions generally are material conditions, the basic material conditions of their lives. And this, I think, is where the story of Judith Shakespeare is potentially instructive. When we turn to page 395, can I get somebody to read for us, starting at the last paragraph there, starting with, it would have been impossible completely and entirely for any woman to have written the plays of Shakespeare in the age of Shakespeare.
What? 395?
395, yep, it's in the last paragraph. After the bit about the bishop.
It would have been impossible, completely
Thank you, Alex.
entirely, for any woman to have written the plays of Shakespeare in the age of Shakespeare. Let me imagine, since facts are so hard to come by, what would have happened to Shakespeare had a wonderfully gifted sister called Judith, let us say. Shakespeare himself went very probably. His mother was an heiress to the grammar school, where he may have learned Latin, Ovid, Virgil, and Horace, and the elements of grammar and logic. He was, it is well shown, a wild boy who poached rabbits, perhaps shot a deer, and had, rather sooner than he should have done, to marry a woman in the neighborhood who bore him a child, rather quicker than was right. That escapade sent him to seek his fortune in London. He had, it seemed, a taste for the theater. He began by holding horses at the stage door. Very soon he got work in the theater, became a successful actor, and lived at the hub of the universe, meeting everybody, knowing everybody, practicing his art on the boards, exercising his wits in the streets, and even getting access to the palace of the queen.
Okay, thank you. So let's pause there for a minute and think about what advantages Will Shakespeare has?
He was sent to school.
Okay, education, yes. He is given a formal education. At the very least in Latin, grammar, and logic, right? What other advantages does he have? Does society give him?
He's talented.
Okay, yeah, he's talented, right? Yeah, so he is given an education that will help him to make use of those talents, right? He learns Latin literature, he learns Latin grammar and logic. And what other maybe less obvious advantages he given?
He was allowed to be like more chaotic. He said he was wild.
Yeah, he gets away with a lot of shit, right? He gets away with poaching rabbits. He gets away with getting a woman pregnant and then running off to London, right? So he is given a pass on a lot of these shady activities, right? He gets away with things. He's not necessarily expected to stick around after he gets this local woman pregnant, right? He suffers no ill consequences for having done so. And what about his career in the theater? Where does it start? Yeah, he starts out as like a stable boy, right? Just watching people's horses while they go into the theater. And from that lowly starting position, is able to work his way up to famous actor and playwright and shareholder in the company, right? So he is able to advance in his chosen profession. Now, let's look at his sister's story. Same parents, right? Same basic set of material circumstances, right? So they're both born to relatively wealthy parents in Stratford-upon-Avon in England. One thing to remember, that one thing we do have to remember, that Judith is fictional, right? She's not real. Woolf is just imagining what the trajectory of Shakespeare's sister's life might have been like if he had one. Can I get somebody to read from Meanwhile His Extraordinarily Gifted Sister?
Meanwhile, his
Thank you.
extraordinarily gifted sister, let us suppose, remained at home. She was as adventurous, as imaginative, as agog to see the world as he was. But she was not sent to school. She had no chance of learning grammar and logic, let alone of reading Horace and Virgil. She picked up a book now and then, one of her brothers perhaps, and read a few pages, but then her parents came in and told her to mend the stockings or mind the stool and not moon about with books and papers. They would have spoken sharply but kindly, for their very substantial people who knew the conditions of life for a woman and loved their daughter. Indeed, more likely than not, she was the apple of her father's eye. Perhaps she scribbled some pages up in the apple loft of the sky, but was careful to hide them or set fire to them soon. However, before she was out of her teens, she was to be
Betrothed, so engaged against your will, basically.
betrothed to the son of neighboring Woolf stapler. Keep going.
Yep.
She cried out the marriage was hateful to her, and for that she was severely beaten by her father. Then he ceased to scold her. He begged her instead not to hurt him, not to shame him in the matter of her marriage. He would give her a chain of beads or fine petticoat, he said, and there were tears in his eyes. How could she disobey him? How could she break his heart? The force of her own gift alone drew her to it. She made her a small parcel of her belongings, let herself down by a rope one summer's night, and took the road to London. She was not 17. The birds that sang in the hedge were not more musical than she was. She had the quickest fancy a gift like her brother's with a tune of words. Like him, she had a taste for the theater. She stood at the stage door. She wanted to act, she said. Men laughed in her face. The manager, a fat, loose lip man, walked. He bellowed something about pools, dancing, women acting. No woman, he said, could possibly be an actress. He hinted, you can imagine in a tavern or roam the streets at midnight. Oh, I'm sorry. He hinted you can imagine what. She could get no train in her crowd. Could she even seek her dinner in the tavern or roam the streets at midnight? Yet her genius was for fiction and lesson to be abundantly upon the lives of men and women and the study of their ways. At last, for she was very young, oddly like Shakespeare, the poet in her face, with the same gray eyes and rounded brows, at last, Nick Green, the actor-manager, took pity on her. She found herself with a child by a gentleman, soul who shall measure the heat and the violence of the poet's heart, when caught entangled in the woman's body, killed herself on winter's night and lies buried at some crosses where the omnibus is now stopped is outside the Elephant and Castle.
Okay, so let's then compare the trajectory of Judith's life with the trajectory of Will's, right?
So she couldn't be with who she wanted to be with. She couldn't marry who she wanted to marry.
Okay, yeah, so she is told not just that she can't marry who she wants, right? But that she must marry, right? So she has no choice about marriage. The marriage that is selected for her is also entirely about economics, right? Her parents are trying to make alliance with another rich upper middle class family, right? And so they want to marry her to the son of that family, regardless of what she wants, right? What else do we see is different about Judith's life, right?
She wants to try to get into the theater scene like her brother is, but people doubt her and say she can't do that.
Yeah. Why specifically is she barred from acting? Yeah, women didn't go on the stage in that period, right? All the parts in Renaissance English theater were played by men, right? Women's parts were played by boys who were apprentices in the company whose voices hadn't changed yet. Yeah, it was considered unseemly for women to be on the stage. And then, those boy actors would, once their voices changed, they graduate to playing male parts. So she is barred from pursuing her career, right? What else is Will given that she isn't given?
You got away with a lot of things, like with her not wanting to get married. She was punished.
Yeah.
She was beaten.
Yeah, she's punished first and then bribed, right? But the idea is that she is subject to her parents' will in this, right? Now Will knocked somebody up, married her quickly, and then ran away, right? So clearly is not bound by parents' choice, and also isn't really even bound by any moral obligation to the woman who got pregnant, right? What happens when Judith gets pregnant? She commits suicide, right? Yeah, she's seduced by an actor, gets pregnant, and kills herself.
Oh, I thought it was saying she was working with him and she just happened to start a relationship with him. No, that wasn't.
Well, the implication is the fact is that things are very different for a woman in a situation like this, right? So her brother, because he doesn't have to physically bear the child, right, can just run away from it. In her case, she's pregnant with some dude's child out of wedlock, right? And can't run away from it. So she is forced to deal with the consequences in a way that, Nick Green, the actor-manager, isn't, right? So the basic point here, right, is that even, these two, the fact of their different genders, like just growing up in the same household, in the same family, conditions what's possible for both of them in life, right? Now, what else is Judith never given at home that would allow her to develop her gifts as a writer?
Books or paper.
Yeah, no books or paper, no formal education, right? What formal education she has, she's had to steal for herself by going through her brother's books. And she's not given any free time either, right? When she picks up one of Will's books, her parents came in and told her to mend the stockings or mind the stew and not moon about with books and papers. All right, and remember that one of the things that Woolf considers necessary for the cultivation of genius is leisure time. If we look at the paragraph that follows this on page 396, right? That more or less is how the story would run, I think, if a woman in Shakespeare's day had had Shakespeare's genius. But for my part, I agree with the deceased bishop, if such he was. It is unthinkable that any woman in Shakespeare's day should have had Shakespeare's genius. For genius like Shakespeare's is not born among laboring, uneducated, servile people. It was not born in England among the Saxons and the Britons. It is not born today among the working classes. How then could it have been born among women whose work began, according to Professor Trevelyan, almost before they were out of the nursery, who were forced to it by their parents and held to it by all the power of law and custom? So what she's making here is not like an argument that women or working class people are incapable naturally of genius, right? But that the lives that they're made to lead doesn't give them the time or the resources to develop it, right? Just as, the early inhabitants of Britain rarely exhibit qualities of genius because they're focused on survival. People who have to work for a living just don't have the same opportunities to cultivate their intellectual faculties. This is Woolf's argument, right? Yet genius of the sort must have existed among women as it must have existed among the working classes. Now and again, an Emily Bronte or a Robert Burns blazes out and proves its presence. But certainly it never got itself onto paper. When, however, one reads of a witch being ducked, of a woman possessed by devils, of a wise woman selling herbs, or even of a very remarkable man who had a mother, then I think we are on the track of a lost novelist, a suppressed poet, of some mutant and glorious Jane Austen, some Emily Bronte who dashed her brains out on the moor or mopped and mowed about the highways crazed with torture that her gift had put her to. So, how is she saying we might interpret some of these women history talks about who were accused of witchcraft or wandered talking to themselves up and down the highways? What does she think these women really were?
Suppressed writers.
Yeah, suppressed writers, frustrated geniuses, right? Society doesn't give them any outlet for their gifts and views any deviation from normal behavior as dangerous, right? So, they're tried as witches, or they're told they're possessed by devils, or whatever, right? Rather than being permitted to express or develop latent genius, right? So each of these women, she suggests, probably is a frustrated genius. Now, let's take this back to the beginning of A Room of One's Own. She mentions this Professor Trevelyan in that passage as her primary source for information about women's lives in the Elizabethan period. So, let's look at what Trevelyan has said about women on page 392. Right, she's looking for specific information about women's lives in English history, right? For it is a perennial puzzle why no women wrote a word of that extraordinary literature when every other man, it seemed, was capable of song or sonnet. What were the conditions in which women lived, I asked myself. For fiction, imaginative work, that is not dropped like a pebble upon the ground, as science may be. Fiction is like a spider's web, attached ever so lightly perhaps, but still attached to life at all four corners. Often the attachment is scarcely perceptible. Shakespeare's plays, for instance, seem to hang there complete by themselves. But when the web is pulled askew, hooked up at the edge, torn in the middle, one remembers that these webs are not spun in midair by incorporeal creatures, but are the work of suffering human beings, and are attached to grossly material things like health and money in the houses we live in. So, how does this metaphor she's using here work? This idea that fiction is like a spider's web. How is fiction like a spider's web?
It's thin.
Think more in terms of what it needs to be attached to. Yeah, a spider's web doesn't just hang there by itself, right? A spider's web has to be attached to real, physical, tangible things. So while it may look like this kind of sparkly, shimmery, gossamer thing just hanging there by itself, right? In order for it to be suspended there, it has to be attached to something. And that is what she is saying, is that fiction is like this, and that fiction has to be attached in some way to material reality. So from here, she proceeds to talking about what women's material reality must have been like, to explain why they weren't producing fiction or poetry in the Elizabethan period, right? I went therefore to the shelf where the histories stand and took down one of the latest, Professor Trevelyan's History of England. Once more I looked up women, found position of, and turned to the pages indicated. Wife-beating, I read, was a recognized right of man and was practiced without shame by high as well as low. Similarly, the historian goes on, the daughter who refused to marry the gentleman of her parents' choice was liable to be locked up, beaten, and flung about the room without any shock being inflicted on public opinion. Marriage was not an affair of personal affection, but of family avarice, particularly in the chivalrous upper classes. Betrothal often took place while one or both of the parties was in the cradle, and marriage when they were scarcely out of the nurse's charge. So we can see the material here that she's using to develop Judith Shakespeare's story, right? That she's pulling this right out of what Professor Trevelyan says about what women's lives were like in the 15th and 16th centuries. That was about 1470, soon after Chaucer's time. The next reference to the position of women is some 200 years later, in the time of the Stuarts. It was still the exception for women of the upper and middle class to choose their own husbands, and when the husband had been assigned, he was lord and master, so far as at least as law and custom could make him. Yet even so, Professor Trevelyan concludes, neither Shakespeare's women nor those of authentic 17th century memoirs, like the Verneys and the Hutchinsons, seem wanting in personality and character. So why does she point out, first off, that it's 200 years between mentions of women in Trevelyan's history? What does that suggest about how important Trevelyan regards women's history? Yeah. First mention is in 1470. Next one doesn't come until 1670, right? Clearly, he's not thinking that this is particularly important. What else does it indicate? How different does a woman's position in society seem to be in 1670 from 1470? Yeah, basically no change, right? So, no reason to talk about women's history in the intervening 200 years because nothing is different, right? And yet, Trevelyan says, Shakespeare's women are not lacking in personality, right? So, she then goes on to talk about the difference between women as they are depicted in literature and women as they would have actually lived, right? And the conclusion she comes to at the end of this paragraph is that indeed, if woman had no existence save in the fiction written by men, one would imagine her a person of the utmost importance, very various, heroic and mean, splendid and sordid, infinitely beautiful and hideous in the extreme, as great as a man, some think even greater. But this is woman in fiction. In fact, as Professor Trevelyan points out, she was locked up, beaten, and flung about the room. So there's a disconnect between the woman of fiction in the British Renaissance and the actual lives of women, right? The imaginary woman, much like the angel in the house, right, is an ideal that no one actually lives up to because they can't. A very queer composite being, page 394, thus emerges. Imaginatively, she is of the highest importance. Practically, she is completely insignificant. She pervades poetry from cover to cover. She is all but absent from history. She dominates the lives of kings and conquerors in fiction. In fact, she was the slave of any boy whose parents forced a ring upon her finger. Some of the most inspired words, some of the most profound thoughts in literature fall from her lips. In real life, she could hardly read, could scarcely spell, and was the property of her husband. So, we're talking about extremely limited horizons here, right? And yet one of the big problems that she notes with the study of women's history generally is, as she puts it, the scarcity of facts. That there's simply not that much known, right? And part of her explanation for this is provided by listing out Professor Trevelyan's chapter headings, right, at page 394. So what I want you to do is sort of like follow me as I read out these chapter headings, right? Think about what's missing from them and what they all seem to have in common. Right? Like what kind of things Professor Trevelyan's history seems to be focused on, right? The manor court and the methods of open field agriculture, the Cistercians in sheep farming, the Crusades, the university, the House of Commons, the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, the Renaissance scholars, the dissolution of the monasteries, agrarian and religious strife, the origin of English sea power, the Armada, and so on. So, do we notice any particular commonalities in the things that Trevelyan is writing about?
It seems like it really don't seem like they all got something to do with each other, like it's out of order.
Well,
Some things have to do with each other.
they actually do all have certain things to do with each other. Do we notice any themes at all here?
It's probably things that women wouldn't really be a part of.
Okay, like what sorts of things?
Like the sheep farming and stuff like that.
Okay, so there's a lot to do with agriculture, right, and management of farms.
And scholars.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot about the history of universities and scholarship, right? So again, women not being permitted to attend universities until the late 19th century. This is also something from which they're excluded, right? What else?
The war and like power stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff about war and politics, right? So all of these kind of fields of life that are elite interests. So what this indicates is that Trevelyan is mostly focused on what's happening at the top of society, right? He's interested not in agriculture as ordinary people practice sheep farming, but as in how lords manage their estates, right? He is interested in war as conflicts between nations and ideologies, right? He is interested in politics essentially as a kind of elite concern. So Trevelyan's history is pretty much a history of social elites. And this isn't uncommon, right? This is the way a lot of history is still done. A lot of history still really only kind of looks at the top slice of society and what happens in the lives of social elites. In part, like when we're looking at past eras, this is often simply easier to know because there's more of a record of it. But what Woolf wants to hint at is ways that one could actually write a more inclusive history. That the information is actually often out there. It's just that no one's bothered to put it together. Right. Occasionally an individual woman is mentioned, an Elizabeth or a Mary, a queen or a great lady. But by no possible means could middle-class women with nothing but brains and character at their command have taken part in any one of the great movements which, brought together, constitute the historian's view of the past. Nor shall we find her in any collection of anecdotes. Aubrey hardly mentions her. She never writes her own life and scarcely keeps a diary. There are only a handful of her letters in existence. She left no plays or poems by which we can judge her. What one wants, I thought, and why does not some brilliant student at Newnham or Girton supply it? Newnham and Girton were women's colleges at Cambridge, which had been opened in the late 19th century. The first ones in England. Is a mass of information. At what age did she marry? How many children had she as a rule? What was her house like? Had she a room to herself? Did she do the cooking? Would she be likely to have a servant? All these facts lie somewhere, presumably, in parish registers and account books. The life of the average Elizabethan woman must be scattered about somewhere, could one collect it and make a book of it. It would be ambitious beyond my daring. I thought, looking about the shelves for books that were not there, to suggest to the students of those famous colleges that they should rewrite history, though I own that it often seems a little queer as it is, unreal, lopsided. But why should they not add a supplement to history? So what she's trying to do is encourage these young women to who she's giving this address, right? It starts out as an address to students at Newnham and Girton. What she's doing is encouraging them to do the kind of historical research that people like Professor Trevelyan have not, right? Dig into these parish records, dig into these local records, and find out what women's lives were really like, right? The information is there, it's just no one has considered it worthy of attention before, right? No one's bothered to compile it. So, do you guys have any questions about any of this stuff so far, by the way? Does this all seem to more or less make sense? Okay. So, I want to look at the end of A Room of One's Own and finish up there for today. Can I get somebody to read the paragraph on page 400 that starts with, I told you in the course of this paper that Shakespeare had a sister.
So during the course of this
Thank you.
paper, that Shakespeare had a sister, but do not look for her in Sir Sidney Lee's Life of a Poet. She died young, alas, she never wrote a word. She lies buried where the
Omnibuses, basically, just buses. That's all they are. Yeah.
Now stop opposite the Elephant and Castle. Now my belief is that the poet who never wrote a word and was buried at the crossroads still lives. She lives in you and in me and in many other women who are not here tonight. For they are washing up the dishes and putting the children to bed. But she lives, for great poets do not die. They are continual presence. They need only the opportunity to walk among us in flesh. The opportunity, as I think it is now coming within your power to give her. For my belief is that if we live another century or so, I'm talking of the common life, which is the real life, and not the little separate lives which we live as individuals and have 500 per year, each of us in rooms of our own. If we have the habit of freedom and the courage to write exactly what we think, if we escape a little from the common sitting room and see human beings not always in their relation to each other, but in relation to reality, and the sky too, and the trees, or whatever it may be in themselves, if we look past Milton's bogies, for no human being should shut out the view if we face the fact, for it is a fact that there is no arm to cling to, but that we go alone, and that our relation is to the world, reality, and not only to the world of men and women. Then opportunity will come, and the dead poet who was Shakespeare's sister will put on the body which she had so often laid down, drawing her life from the lives of the unknown who were her forerunners, as her brothers did before her. She will be born. As for her coming without the preparation, without the effort in our part, without the determination that when she is born again, she shall find it possible to live and write her poetry, that we cannot expect for that would be impossible, but to maintain that she would come if we work for her, and that so took work, even if the poverty and obscurity is worthwhile.
Thank you. So what's the legacy here she sketches out for this figure of Shakespeare's sister?
That other woman can take on her spirit kind of and write good things for her.
Yeah, that she's kind of less an individual presence and almost more of kind of like a publicly available idea, right? And that given the right material conditions, which are coming into their own for young women in the early 1920s, she argues, this poor suicide who was left voiceless at the end of the 16th century can have a voice, can speak at the beginning of the 20th century, right? That she can be sort of like reinvigorated by a new generation of young women who aren't held back by the same limitations. But this seems to, this relates to the whole idea of the angel in the house that she talks about in Professions for Women. Because what does she say women have to do in order to access this spirit? What do they have to disconnect themselves from and connect themselves to?
They have to disconnect themselves from the angel in the house and connect themselves with reality.
Yeah, with reality, right? And not with the society of other men and women, right? They have to forget about social expectations and write what is honest and true according to their particular lights, right? Okay, so that's really all I have for you today. We'll stop there. Good job in the presentation today, guys. Remember to upload your slides and your reviews of one another to Georgia View. All of that is, of course, kept strictly private and confidential. we will talk about Jean Reese on Tuesday.